Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today we're going to be tackling a really important topic,
Yep.
and that's homelessness in America. And it might be surprising to some folks out there, but
Mm.
2024 actually saw a pretty dramatic increase in homelessness across the U.S. We're talking an 18.1% increase, which means that something like 23 out of every 10,000 people are now experiencing homelessness. To really dig into all of this, we're going to be focusing on a recent article from the Associated Press. The title is a bit of a mouthful, but it's U.S. homelessness up 18% as affordable housing remains out of reach for many people. And it was published just a few days ago, December 27, 2024.
Yeah, 18.1% is definitely a significant jump, especially when you consider that 2023 also saw a pretty big increase of around 12%. So it does
Right.
paint a sort of bleak picture, and I think it's really crucial to understand why this is happening.
Totally agree. And, the article dives right into some of the reasons behind this trend. Obviously, lack of affordable housing is a major factor.
Hmm.
But they also mention natural disasters and a surge in migration to certain cities.
Right? It's like this kind of perfect storm of factors all happening at the same time. You've got rising rents, the end of all those pandemic assistance programs, and then this influx of migrants, many of whom are families, all putting immense pressure on these already strained resources for affordable housing.
Yeah, and the article really highlights the struggles families are facing. They report almost a 40% increase in family homelessness just this year. And some cities have been hit particularly hard. The article mentions Denver, Chicago, and New York City, where family homelessness has more than doubled.
Yeah.
Can you even imagine what that must be like?
It's truly heartbreaking. The article states that almost 150,000 children were homeless on a single night in 2024. That's a 33% jump from just the year before. When you think about the impact that kind of instability can have on a kid's development, both physically and emotionally, it's just sobering.
Yeah.
It really raises questions about, how prepared our current support systems actually are to handle these changing demographics and the specific needs that families, especially those with young children, really require.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
We can't just assume that what works for one group will automatically work for another. And it's not just families feeling the pressure. The article also talks about how natural disasters contribute to the problem. They use the 2023 Maui wildfire as an example, mentioning that over 5,200 people were in emergency shelters in Hawaii on the night of the count.
Right. It's a stark reminder of how vulnerable people without stable housing really are, particularly when it comes to natural disasters. They often have very limited options for safe shelter and are disproportionately impacted by these events.
Definitely a sobering thought. It's a reminder that for many people, even just having a place to go during an emergency is a luxury. But the article did have a little bit of good news. And that was regarding veteran homelessness. It actually decreased in 2024, dropping 8% overall and an even more significant 11% for veterans who are living unsheltered. I'm curious, why do you think we're seeing this trend with veterans when the overall numbers are going up?
Well, it is encouraging to see progress being made, especially in a demographic that has historically struggled with high rates of homelessness. The article points to a few things contributing to this success. Things like bipartisan political support, dedicated funding, and policies designed specifically for veterans. I think it just highlights that when there's political will and a commitment to invest in effective strategies, we can actually make a difference.
So it sounds like there's potentially a lot we can learn from what's working for veterans and how we can maybe apply those lessons to other groups experiencing homelessness. Would you agree with that?
I think that's a crucial takeaway from all of this data. The success with veterans really shows how important things like political will, resource allocation are, and most importantly, the need for strategies that are actually evidence-based.
Hmm.
When we try to tackle this multifaceted issue, it's not just about putting a band-aid on the symptoms, it's about really getting to the root causes of homelessness in a way that's both targeted and effective.
Yeah, it's interesting. The article also touches on this growing trend of cities implementing stricter measures against homelessness, things like camping bans. On the one hand, I can understand the concerns about safety and cleanliness, but I also worry about whether this just criminalizes homelessness. It seems like a very complex issue with no easy answers.
It absolutely is. And the article even mentions a Supreme Court ruling that basically paved the way for these bans. So it's definitely become a very contentious issue with strong opinions on both sides. Some folks argue that encampments pose real risks to public health and safety, while others see these bans as further marginalizing and punishing people who are already struggling. It really highlights the need for more nuanced conversations and a deeper understanding of just how complex this issue really is.
Yeah, you're right. There's definitely no easy answers here. And it seems like we need to be careful not to oversimplify things
Mhm.
and acknowledge that there are valid concerns on both sides. But, The article does offer a little bit of hope. It highlights a few cities that have actually seen some success in reducing homelessness.
Yeah, it is important to see that progress is being made in some places. For example, they talk about how Dallas saw a 16% drop in homelessness between 2022 and 2024 after completely overhauling their approach to the issue. And Los Angeles, which has been focusing on increasing housing options, has seen a 5% decrease in unsheltered homelessness since 2023.
Those are really encouraging examples. It would be interesting to learn more about the specific changes they made in those cities, especially Dallas,
Yeah.
to see what we can learn from their successes. Maybe that's something we can get into a bit later. But it's also worth noting that the U.S. was actually making pretty good progress in reducing homelessness between 2007 and 2017, particularly when it came to housing for veterans.
Right. That period really shows what can happen when there's a focused effort and when resources are dedicated to addressing the problem. But the article does point out that things started to climb again in 2020, and that's likely due to the pandemic. And its ripple effects on the economy, housing affordability, and all of those social safety nets, it really underscores how interconnected all of these socioeconomic factors are, and how something like a pandemic can make an already complex situation even worse.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that progress isn't always linear, and that even when we make gains, we need to stay adaptable and ready to address new challenges. Okay, before we move on too far, the article did make one final point about where homelessness is concentrated across the country. They mentioned that California continues to have the largest homeless population.
Right. And then after California, it's New York, Washington, Florida, and Massachusetts. All of these states are facing their own unique challenges, things like high housing costs, population density, and different levels of investment in social services and affordable housing. It's clear there's no one-size-fits-all solution here, and that addressing homelessness effectively will require different approaches based on each region's specific circumstances.
That makes sense, and it sounds like we have a lot more to unpack here. But
Right.
before we dive deeper, what do you think is like the most striking takeaway from this initial overview of the issue?
For me, it's the stark contrast we see between the progress made in reducing veteran homelessness and the overall increase in homelessness across the nation. It really makes you wonder, what can we learn from what's worked for veterans, and how can we apply those lessons to the broader homeless population?
Yeah, it's a question worth exploring for sure. I mean, it's fascinating to see how veteran homelessness has seen some real targeted success.
Yeah.
While at the same time, the broader issue of homelessness, seems to be kind of slipping through the cracks. It really highlights the need for these like comprehensive strategies and a real sustained commitment to tackling the problem, not just these short-term fixes that we see so often.
Absolutely. And speaking of strategies, the article did mention some interesting initiatives that are being implemented across the country, like the housing first approach that cities like Houston and Philadelphia are adopting. I've heard that term before, but to be honest, I'm not totally sure how it works. Could you explain that a bit more? Sure. It's actually a pretty simple concept at its core. Basically, the housing first model focuses on getting people into stable housing as quickly as possible, and without all those preconditions we often see, like requiring sobriety or employment. The idea is that once someone has a safe and stable place to live, it gives them a foundation to start addressing other challenges they might be facing, like mental health issues or substance abuse.
So instead of saying like, hey, you need to get your act together before you qualify for housing, you're saying it's more effective to provide that stability first
Yeah.
and then help them address those other needs.
Exactly. A lot of traditional models have all these barriers to entry. They require people to meet certain criteria before they can even access housing assistance. But the problem is, when you're struggling with homelessness, just meeting those basic needs can feel overwhelming, let alone trying to tackle complex issues like addiction or mental health. Housing first flips that script around. It recognizes that having a stable home environment is essential for overall well-being, and it can actually increase a person's chances of successfully dealing with those other challenges.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's hard to focus on getting your life back on track when you don't even have a safe place to sleep at night. But is there any research to back this up? Does it actually lead to better outcomes?
There's actually a growing body of evidence that suggests housing first is not only more humane, but it's also more effective. Studies have shown that people who are placed in housing first programs are more likely to stay housed. They see improvements in their physical and mental health, and they're less reliant on emergency services like shelters and hospitals.
So it's not just about putting a roof over their heads. It's about creating this ripple effect of positive change in their lives. But I'm sure there must be some drawbacks to this approach. What about concerns about accountability and making sure that people are still working toward self-sufficiency?
Those are definitely valid concerns. And it's important to point out that housing first doesn't mean just handing someone a free apartment and walking away. It's about providing that stable foundation and then pairing it with support services that are tailored to that individual's needs. That might include things like mental health care, substance abuse treatment, job training, or financial counseling. The key is to provide this holistic approach that really empowers people to address those challenges and work towards becoming more independent.
Got it. So it's not a hands-off approach. It's about providing both the resources and the support to help people get back on their feet.
Exactly. And that's where collaboration becomes really important. Successful Housing First programs often involve partnerships between government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and community groups. It takes a coordinated effort to make sure people have access to all the different services they might need.
That makes sense. It's not something one organization can do on its own. But while we're talking about potential solutions, I wanted to go back to something the article mentioned, this whole issue of encampment clearings. We touched on it a bit earlier, but I think it deserves a little more discussion. I understand the arguments about public safety and hygiene, but I also find it troubling to think about displacing people who are already so vulnerable. What are your thoughts on how we balance those competing interests?
Yeah, it's a tough balance to strike. And there's no easy answer, to be honest. Encampment clearings can be incredibly disruptive and even traumatic for the people living in them. You're disrupting their lives, which are already precarious, and often forcing them to scatter to different locations, which just makes it harder for outreach workers to connect with them and provide support.
So it's not just about moving people out of sight. It's about understanding the real consequences of those actions.
Exactly. And in a lot of cases, those consequences outweigh any perceived benefits. Just displacing people without offering them viable alternatives doesn't address the root causes of homelessness. It often just pushes the problem somewhere else and can even make things worse by making it harder for people to access services and get the support they need.
Yeah, it seems like a band-aid solution at best, and potentially even harmful. But what about the concerns that residents and businesses raise about safety, sanitation, and the impact of encampments on the surrounding community? How do we address those concerns without just pushing people away?
I think it requires a fundamental shift in perspective. We need to stop viewing encampment clearings as a solution and instead focus on addressing the underlying issues that contribute to homelessness in the first place. That means investing in affordable housing options, expanding access to mental health and substance abuse treatment, and creating pathways to employment and self-sufficiency. When we address those root causes, the symptoms will naturally start to diminish.
So it's not just about enforcement, it's about investing in prevention and support.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that simply criminalizing homelessness is not the answer. It's a complex issue that demands a multifaceted approach, one that prioritizes compassion, understanding, and a real commitment to finding solutions that are both humane and effective.
Okay, so circling back to affordable housing,
Hmm.
which the article really pointed to as a major driver of this recent spike in homelessness. You mentioned earlier the strain on resources with rising rents and the end of pandemic assistance. But how did we even get to this point? I remember a time when affordable housing wasn't such a crisis.
Right. It's a complex issue with a long history. But essentially, we're facing this perfect storm of factors that have come together to create this crisis. Stagnant wages, rising housing costs, and a chronic lack of affordable housing units have all played a part. And on top of that, we've seen a decrease in federal funding for affordable housing programs, which has only made the problem worse.
So it's not just about building more housing in general. It's about making sure that the housing that's available is actually affordable for the people who need it most. What can be done to address that fundamental issue?
There's no quick fix, unfortunately, but there are a few things we can do. We need to invest in building more affordable housing units, both through government programs and by incentivizing private developers to create mixed income housing developments. We also need policies that protect tenants from things like unfair evictions and rent hikes.
So it's about creating a system that supports housing stability for everyone, not just those who can afford market rate rents.
Exactly. And that might involve looking at some innovative solutions like rent control measures or inclusionary zoning policies that require developers to set aside a certain percentage of units for affordable housing.
It sounds like there are a lot of different approaches being considered, and it's good to hear that there are options out there. But given all the complexities we've talked about, from natural disasters and migration to these debates around encampment clearings and affordable housing, What do you think will be the most crucial factor in addressing homelessness going forward?
We've covered a lot of important factors, but I really think it boils down to a shift in perspective. We need to move away from blaming individuals for their circumstances and recognize that homelessness is a systemic issue that's rooted in the way our society is structured and the policies we have in place.
A shift in perspective. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure, I think we often fall into the trap of blaming individuals for their situation without really acknowledging the systemic factors that contribute to homelessness. We need to start seeing housing as a human right, not a privilege that's only for those who can afford it. We need to prioritize policies that promote social equity and invest in solutions that address the root causes of homelessness, not just manage its symptoms.
That's a really powerful thought. It's not just about changing policies, it's about changing hearts and minds. But how do we actually achieve that kind of shift in perspective? It seems like such a daunting task.
It's definitely not easy, but I think it starts with education and awareness. We need to have open and honest conversations about how complex homelessness really is. We need to challenge those stereotypes and misconceptions that people often have. We need to highlight the human stories behind the statistics so that people can develop empathy and understanding. And most importantly, we need to advocate for policies and initiatives that reflect this new perspective. We need to make housing a fundamental right for everyone.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just about charity, it's about social justice
Yeah.
and creating a society that values the well-being of all its members. And I think you're right. It's an incredibly helpful message, and one that I think a lot of people need to hear. Before we get too carried away with the optimism, I did want to circle back to something the article highlighted, this alarming trend of increasing family homelessness,
Mm.
with children being particularly vulnerable. Can you talk a bit more about the unique challenges that families experiencing homelessness face and how we can better address their needs?
Yeah, it really is heartbreaking to think about all those families going through this. I mean, imagine the stress and trauma for parents who are just trying to keep their family safe and fed and together, all while lacking those basic necessities like shelter and consistent hygiene. It's incredibly difficult. And the impact on the children, especially, can be devastating. It really affects their development, both physically and emotionally. It's a lot for them to carry.
Yeah, it's truly heartbreaking. And it's hard to even fathom the long-term consequences for these kids. So is there anything that can be done, to help mitigate those effects and provide better support for families in these situations?
Absolutely. And it's really important to remember that homeless families are not all the same. Their situations and needs can vary so much. Some might be fleeing domestic violence, others could be dealing with job loss or an unexpected eviction. And then you have families who are new immigrants just struggling to navigate this really complex system.
So it sounds like a one-size-fits-all approach wouldn't really be effective in addressing those needs.
You're exactly right. We need these tailored interventions that take into account the unique circumstances of each family. For example, families with young children might need access to things like childcare and early childhood education programs, while those escaping violence might require more specialized legal and social services to help them rebuild their lives safely.
So it's really about creating this comprehensive support system that helps empower these families to regain their stability and start working towards a better future.
Exactly. And part of that means addressing the root causes of family homelessness, which often go beyond just the lack of affordable housing, things like access to quality education and healthcare, and making sure people are earning living wages so they can actually meet their family's needs. Those are all critical factors.
It sounds like a really complex problem that requires a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Are there any programs or initiatives out there that you think are doing a good job of meeting the specific needs of homeless families?
There are some encouraging signs. Some cities are starting to implement these family-focused housing programs that offer wraparound services, including childcare, educational support, job training, and financial counseling. These programs recognize that you have to address the needs of the entire family unit if you want to see long-term success.
It's great to hear about these types of initiatives, but it also makes it clear how urgent this issue is and the need for more widespread support. I think this deep dive has really driven home the point that homelessness isn't just a problem for the people directly affected.
Mhm.
It impacts all of us.
I completely agree. Homelessness affects entire communities. It impacts our economy, our social fabric, and even our collective sense of humanity. Addressing this issue really requires all of us to step up, not just government agencies and nonprofits, but people from all walks of life.
Yeah, I think our listeners are starting to get a sense of the bigger picture here. It's not just about charity, it's about social justice. and creating a society that actually cares about the well-being of all its members. The article did mention some of the more positive examples, like the successes we've seen in places like Dallas and Houston. Can you talk a little bit more about those and what we can learn from their approaches?
Of course. So Dallas, for instance, saw a big drop in homelessness after they basically overhauled their entire system. They created this really coordinated approach, bringing together government agencies, nonprofits, and community groups to offer a whole range of services, from housing to job training, all under one roof. This more integrated approach made it easier for people to access services
Yeah.
and created a much more efficient and effective system of care.
So it's about breaking down those silos and getting everyone working together.
Exactly. Now, Houston, on the other hand, has had great success with their housing first approach, especially when it comes to reducing chronic homelessness. By making it a priority to get people into stable housing right away without all the usual conditions, they've seen some amazing improvements in people's lives, both in terms of their overall well being and their ability to support themselves.
It really shows how sometimes the simplest solution, just meeting that basic human need for shelter, can have the most profound impact.
I think that's a great way to put it. Now, of course, it's important to remember that every city is different, so what works in one place might not work in another. But these examples do show that progress is possible when there's a commitment to finding creative solutions, working together, and focusing on strategies that are actually proven to work.
And it sounds like community engagement is a big part of that too.
Absolutely. To really address homelessness effectively, you need everyone to be on board. That includes people with lived experience, community leaders, businesses, and residents. It's about coming together as a community to find solutions that benefit everyone.
It's about building that shared sense of responsibility and creating a more inclusive and supportive environment for all.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the complexities of homelessness, the challenges faced by families and individuals, and some of the potential solutions being implemented across the country. As we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the single most crucial factor in addressing homelessness going forward?
After all the things we've discussed, I really believe it comes down to political will. We need our elected officials to actually prioritize this issue. We need them to allocate the necessary resources and to enact policies that promote affordable housing, expand access to those essential support services, and really address the systemic factors that contribute to homelessness in the first place.
So it's not enough to just have good intentions. We need to see concrete actions and real investments.
Exactly. And that's going to require pressure from the public, advocacy, and holding our leaders accountable. We have to make sure they're committed to creating a society where everyone has a safe and stable place to call home. Well said. You've definitely given us a lot to think about today. Before we go, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Just a reminder to everyone that homelessness is not just a statistic, it's a human tragedy. But it's a tragedy that we can overcome by working together with compassion and a commitment to finding real solutions.
Yeah.
We can create a world where everyone has a place to belong.
That's a really powerful message. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been a really enlightening and thought-provoking conversation.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this episode has shed some light on this important issue and maybe even inspired you to get involved in your own communities. Remember, even small actions can make a big difference.